Thanks very much for inviting me to be here. It's really nice. I've enjoyed a lot of the talks and learnt a lot, so thanks very much. The reason I'm giving a talk on this topic is because Annika asked me to, so about the relationship between research and clinical practice in these kind of areas. And it has its origins in some ways. I tried about 15 years ago at a meeting in Cambridge to introduce the idea of a hybrid approach to consent, sort of hybrid clinical and research, and basically got chased out of town. So, you know, may as well have another go. And so that's, I think Annika just wanted to see me suffer a little bit. Anyway, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. The idea is to look at this relationship between clinical practice and research in the context of genomics, specifically. It's not an ethics talk, but I'm coming at this topic from an ethics lens. A lot of it builds on some of the things that Dominic's been saying, so that's actually really helpful for me as well. And the aim here is not necessarily to answer any of these questions, but to essentially ask you to think, well, how, you know, maybe we should be rethinking the relationship between research and clinical practice at a sort of conceptual and practical level. And I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that, and this is one way of doing that. So the big picture here is I'm going to introduce two possible ways of thinking about consent in this space. One is as a hybrid, and the other is as an alloy. So the first question I suppose to ask is, why is it that we have historically kept these things separate and seen them as separate? There are a number of reasons for that. Some of them are institutional. So, for example, it's not an accident that the Helsinki Declaration in 1964 was drawn up by the World Medical Association, because at that time most medical research was done by doctors, so that seemed to make sense. That's much less the case now. Much medical research is done in different kinds of institutions, not by doctors, but by computational biologists, a whole range of other types of people. So there are institutional reasons why these two things have become separate. There are other reasons too. Some of them are to do with the primary objective of the task. So when we're doing research, we're primarily trying to generate some kind of generalizable knowledge. When we're doing clinical practice, we're aiming to benefit patients, benefit individual patients or populations. And those are two different intentions. There are also important different types of ethical problems that arise in those two settings. So when we're talking about research, the types of tensions that arise are to do with, well, or questions that arise are to do with, okay, how likely is it that this piece of work designed in this particular way is going to generate useful knowledge that's going to benefit people in the future, or just help us to understand biological mechanisms better than we did? And what are the kinds of levels of risks that are going to be undertaken by participants to generate that knowledge? So it's not about their care, it's about knowledge. And Helsinki and others, and Dominic mentioned this too, have introduced this idea of minimal risk. So what, you know, we're keen to generate knowledge, but we're only willing to do that up to a certain point, a certain level of risk for participants. When we think about clinical practice, that we face a different kind of tension. Usually this is about tensions between patient autonomy and benefit. We want to benefit patients, we want to do what they want, what they'd like us to do, but sometimes those things pull in different directions. So another way in which research and clinical practice differ is because that they raise different kinds of problems. Similarly, when it comes to consent, as we heard, consent standards are different in these two domains. So consent standards in research tend to be very rigorous. They're to do with very specific levels of consent information, for example. Informed consent is the term that gets used very commonly in these guidelines. And the expectations are that that's what we should achieve. So we start to get questions start to arise when we're talking about things like broad consent, for example, in the research context. That's because we have a sort of starting expectation that people should know what's going to happen with their data and to them. In the context of clinical care, it's much more commonly the case that we're willing to work on in situations where consent is less clear, where there may be an implied consent. We may take the view that actually we've got enough evidence here that this is what the patient would have wanted. And in some cases, we'll override consent altogether. So there are two domains here that relate to consent and seem different. And for ethics reasons, there's been a whole range of reasons why we've wanted to keep those two things separately too. So as Dominic mentioned, the worry about blurring that boundary has been this worry about what's sometimes called the therapeutic misconception. So the idea that people who are being recruited into a research study mistakenly think this is about their treatment. So that's been a historical concern. Or that because they're asked by a doctor, they find it difficult to say no. So these worries about voluntariness and about information. And then another reason why research and clinical practice tend to be kept separately or understood separately is because there are different oversight mechanisms, different kinds of governance that relate to those two things. So historically, there's been this whole set of reasons why those two things have tended to be seen as separate. But there are a whole range of factors now, many of them to do with genomics, which are forcing those two things much more closely together, at least much more closely related. So we've heard today about a whole range of reasons why doing large studies with well-curated data sets has the potential to generate knowledge that can't be generated by smaller studies of smaller amounts of information. So there's an awareness that research and clinical practice can benefit from each other there. There's obviously lots of controversy about this, as we heard in the meeting today, but there's at least an increased sense that research has the potential sometimes to generate findings which may be of benefit to patients in a more direct way rather than through published literature. We've got this move towards what's sometimes called the learning healthcare system. So the idea that there ought to be a learning built into our healthcare systems in ways which has an evaluation element, but also a research element. So we're getting used to the idea of learning healthcare systems. Pushes for precision medicine, which require ongoing evidence generation to facilitate precision. And again, at a more institutional level, we've got the rise of technological platforms of various kinds. So Genomics England, Deciphering Developmental Disorders Project, for example. We've got platforms which have the potential to serve both of those aims simultaneously. So a whole range of factors that are pushing research and clinical practice close together. And this isn't just true in genomics, of course. This is true across the whole of medicine, the whole range of ways in which we're increasingly seeing the benefit of research and clinical practice being close together. So what I want to do is sort of introduce two models for ways in which we might think about that relationship and see what you think. So the first is the idea of this being a hybrid, thinking about it as a hybrid. So this is I think it's a Tabor, it's blackberries and raspberries, hybrid. So one way of thinking about the hybrid is that we see research and clinical practice as being increasingly connected, but nonetheless distinct in important ways. So that they have separate core identities and intentions, purposes and governance, but they're related in new ways and maybe newly dense and complicated ways. But nevertheless, they're separate enough in the sense that the interactions between these two things need to be carefully managed. There needs to be oversight of that relationship. So an example will be where you've got a clinical activity, which feeds data into research, but with specific valid consent, validated findings, subject to all the things we've been talking about today, can then get fed back into the health system. So that's the hybrid approach. Think about the contrast is the alloy, what I'm calling the alloy approach here. So this is bronze, which is like copper and tin and a few other things mixed in. But so this is an alloy of two things put together to make something completely new. So in this model, research and clinical practice fully merge into a new unified enterprise. So, and what does this mean? Well, it means that traditional views about who's a patient and who's a participant dissolve. We're going to need new ethical frameworks because the old ones that see these things as separate don't apply in the same kind of way. So we're going to need to rethink how we think about ethics. So we're going to need new forms of oversight and governance. Well, how might this work in practice? Well, basically it means that every clinical encounter in the hospital generates research data and all care pathways evolve in real time in relation to research. So it's all part of the same thing. And I'll come back in a minute to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of those two approaches as a way of informing later discussion. But I think all of this takes place against a set of other things that are going on to do with how innovation works in healthcare. And I think this is relevant. So one way of thinking about this will be as a spectrum. So at one end of the spectrum, we've got the traditional translational pipeline model. So you generate possible new drugs. They go through a whole range of trials of various kinds. At some point they get approved, and then they're deployed in the health system subject to appropriate oversight and so on. So that's one model. That doesn't seem quite right for the kind of activities that we're talking about here. That seems like there's enough pressure on that from the world we're talking about to feel that's not quite right. At the other end, we've got the Silicon Valley approach, which I've called the agile iterative approach here, which is you essentially develop something, you deploy it, you see how it works in the real world, and you iterate over time. So, mobile phone, software, etc. apps and so on. So but that doesn't seem, that seems an important part of what we're doing, but it doesn't seem quite right either, particularly when we're talking about things which have all the potential to develop, to produce harms or of various kinds that we've heard about today. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got this idea of the learning healthcare system, where improvement is continuous, it's bi-directional, it goes research benefits, clinical practice benefits. And I think a lot hangs on how you think about innovation and how you want to think about innovation. I'm not necessarily saying you need to choose between those two things, but the spectrum seems relevant to this conversation. So now I just want to talk about the benefits and downsides of each of these models, and then sort of open up a discussion. Well, hopefully on the panel we'll talk about it. So one of the benefits of the hybrid model, even though I was kicked out of town for saying it last time, is that there is at least ethical clarity, and it's continuous with the way in which we currently think about research and clinical practice. They're more connected, but nonetheless, there's enough difference and clarity for people to know where they stand. There are different governance systems for those two activities. They may need to be more connected, but nonetheless, they're different. Doctors and patients, participants, know where they stand, because these two things can be explained in ways that are distinct but connected. We know what a raspberry is, we know what a blackberry is, etc., for example. And there's clarity for everyone in concern. So this is one reason why the hybrid model might be an approach. So it's less separate than we currently have it, but it's a step in a different direction. So what are the weaknesses of this? Well, there's all sorts of potential for duplication of processes and procedures. You've got these two systems going on. You've got what I think look increasingly like artificial boundaries between activities that we've heard about today. And of course, there's greater or less enthusiasm for that blurring, but nonetheless, the blurring is happening and doesn't seem likely to go away. You've got slower clinical implementation of research insights, which obviously may bring benefits as well as harms, but nonetheless, it's slower. And then you've got, and it's related to all these other things, you've then got these data silos and potential missed opportunities, which, you know, bearing in mind what's been said today, an opportunity for one person may also be a problem for someone else, so not prejudging that. So those are the strengths and weaknesses of the hybrid model. What about the ally model? Well, there are a number of benefits here too, and in a way they're the other side of the coin from the hybrid model. There are potentially huge benefits to be achieved from the seamless integration of research and clinical practice, knowledge generation and its application. There's the potential for accelerated implementation, innovation and implementation, and there's much more efficient, comprehensive and coordinated use of data. And there's also, I think, so one of the things I've noticed from today, but also in other conversations, is the tendency to think of people as if they're kind of static. The way that patients respond to uncertainty now and the way they worry about data uses now is how they're going to be worrying about them in 20 years' time. That seems highly unlikely to me. So this one potential value of the ally model is it allows the possibility of new forms of patient-participant engagement with medicine and medical research, and new ways of thinking, and potentially new ways of living with uncertainty and risk that could be productive. So that's the benefit side. The challenge side here is there is no history to this kind of approach. So because of the clarity that we have about the ways in which we think about ethics of research and clinical practice, which have all the sorts of problems associated with it that we've heard about today, nonetheless, we have some at least sense of where we stand. This potentially throws things up in the air, and we have to rethink things which have potential implications for public trust and trust of other kinds too, trustworthiness. So that could potentially be associated with potential dilution of important protections. I don't think that necessarily has to be the case, but it could be the case. There's a diffusion of accountability and responsibility. Who is responsible? It starts to look like researchers have some kind of clinical responsibility under this model. That may or may not be a bad thing. To some extent, you could say they already ought to have, to some degree, in some ways. So how does one think about that? And this, as I said before, the potential risk to public trust that arises out of this kind of change. So those are some advantages and disadvantages of those two approaches. I personally don't think that the hybrid approach is so kind of radically challenging that, you know, I think that seems like a more conservative approach in this context than it did 15 years ago, to be honest. So I think it is a choice between these kind of two kinds of things. And it may be that we end up with a hybrid of the hybrids, as it were, that in some places one is appropriate. So one thing that sometimes people say, and they said at that meeting when I raised it the first time, is that, well, you know, but you're going to have to talk to people and explain this to them. consent is a big problem here. How is it possible really to have a conversation with a patient, who has got all these other worries, and explain to them in a clear way, a way that's going to enable you to get valid consent, so valid rather than informed, valid meaning informed, voluntary, and competent, for something which is a hybrid or an alloy of research and clinical practice. Now, I think that is a red herring. I think firstly it's an empirical question, so we'd have to find out. We'd have to do some research on different methods. But the evidence suggests, I think, that that's not necessarily going to be a problem. So you might want to contrast that hybrid approach with current approaches to consent. But our current approaches to consent in the clinical setting are in fact already hybrid. So when we get consent from a patient for an intervention, not research, but to do something, then we're essentially trying to meet the standards of two different types of law. So which we're bringing concerns about battery, which is to do with the nature of the intervention, trust, which is one area of law, and concerns about negligence, which is to do with a whole range of things to do with standards of care, amounts of information. We don't actually sit there and say, well, let's do the battery bit here and the negligence bit here. We have a conversation which has evolved, which enables us to address those two things in ways which are clear and capable of meeting appropriate legal standards. Why couldn't we achieve the same thing in the context of research and clinical practice? It may not be possible, but I do think that's an empirical question rather than a question of principle. So I'd like us to think about that. The other thing to bear in mind is that in the alloy model, as opposed to the hybrid model, there aren't actually two purposes. There's one purpose. It's just a purpose which combines knowledge generation and clinical care. Okay, some questions for consideration either in discussion or just things to mull over. So one question is, which values should guide our choice between these different models and when they're applied? How might, if we decided to go down one or other of these routes, how might governance mechanisms have to evolve to be appropriate to deal with those in a way that maintains public trust and confidence? Who should decide which path to take and when? How do we ensure that the benefits and risks are equitably distributed? Because there may well be situations where the people who are taking the risks of research are not necessarily the people who are benefiting, so we'd have to think about that. Classic example in my world is global health surveillance, where all the surveillance is going to happen in poor countries and all the benefits are going to largely happen in rich countries. And what kind of additional protections might need to be in place? So I'm skeptical about the idea that consent can do all the work of ethics. Consent is important, it needs to be done really well. But I think the question we should always ask ourselves, even if consent is done really, really well, what other things do we need to have in place to ensure that people are not harmed in a range of other ways? Stop here. Thank you.